I always thought I had a pretty good sense of things in my marriage. My wife, Sarah, and I had been together for almost a decade, married for 7. We had our fair share of ups and downs, like any couple, but I never had any reason to suspect anything was off. We lived in a nice, quiet suburb in Florida, and for the most part, life seemed like it was running smoothly. Or so I thought. But lately, there were these little things that gnawed at me, things I couldn't quite put my finger on. Sarah had started to dress a little differently, wearing more expensive clothes and accessories. At first, I didn't think much of it. She had a good job in sales, and she had just closed some big deal in New York a few months back. She came back from that trip glowing, talking about how they had landed a new client and how she was moving up in the company. To celebrate, they gave her a bonus and, apparently, some pretty nice jewelry. That's what she told me, anyway. It all began innocently enough. One night, she was getting ready for dinner with her friends, and I noticed this new necklace around her neck. Silver, delicate, and unmistakably expensive. I didn't remember ever buying it for her. It struck me as odd, so I asked, "Where'd you get that from?" She smiled, that easy smile she always had. "Oh, this? The company gifted it to me after the New York deal. Just a little reward for all the hard work." I wanted to believe her. I mean, why wouldn't I? But something didn't sit right. I brushed it off at the time, telling myself I was being paranoid. She'd never given me a reason not to trust her, right? Still, the thought lingered. Over the next few months, more little things started piling up. New earrings, a bracelet, a designer bag. She always had an explanation, though. Just another gift from the company, she'd say, or a bonus for a job well done. But the jewelry, there was something different about it. It felt personal, intimate, nothing like what a company would give. One night, after she had fallen asleep, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every smile, every detail that didn't add up. The more I thought about it, the more those suspicions began to fester. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but I didn't want to listen. I loved Sarah. I still do. But love doesn't blind you to what's right in front of your face forever. Then, a few weeks ago, she mentioned another trip, this time to Miami. Another business trip, she said. She was packing her bags in a hurry, saying how they'd booked her into some fancy hotel, and she'd be back in a few days. I nodded, smiled, and kissed her goodbye, but I wasn't convinced. I had a plan now. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I slipped a tracker into her purse. Just a tiny little thing I'd bought online, something she'd never notice. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I needed to know. I took a leave of absence from work, making up some excuse about needing time off for personal reasons. I didn't tell her. She thought I was still going to the office while she was away. Once she left, I sat at the kitchen table, watching the tracker on my phone. My heart was racing the entire time, my mind going 100 miles a minute, wondering if I was making a mistake. But I couldn't stop. I had to see. When she landed in Miami, the tracker showed her going straight to the hotel she had mentioned. Everything seemed normal at first. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that she was really there for business like she'd said. But then, a few hours later, the dot on the map started to move. It wasn't towards a business meeting or a client's office. Instead, it was heading to the beach. I sat there, phone in hand, watching as the dot stopped at a small, luxurious resort by the water. That's when the sinking feeling in my gut came back. I wasn't just being paranoid. I got into my car and drove. I didn't even think twice about it. The 5-hour drive to Miami felt like it took forever, my mind racing the whole way. By the time I got there, the sun was setting. I parked a little ways down the street from the resort, trying to stay out of sight as I checked the tracker one last time. She was still there. I made my way through the palm trees, weaving in and out of the shadows, feeling like a damn fool. What was I even doing? But as I got closer, I heard laughter, her laughter. It cut through the air, sharp and carefree, like she didn't have a single worry in the world. And then I saw them. There she was, sitting by the pool, a glass of wine in her hand, laughing and leaning into him. A man I had never seen before. He was handsome, confident, and she looked at him like she used to look at me. I felt the world tilt under my feet. When I drove back home after seeing them together, My mind was already racing. The pain was unbearable, but it was the anger that consumed me. This wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. She had lied to my face, carried on her little affair right under my nose, and now she thought she could just come home and pretend everything was normal. But no more. This time, I was going to take action. The day Sarah returned from Miami, I acted like nothing had changed. She walked into our home, smiling, kissed me on the cheek, and asked about my day. I played along, pretending like I didn't know a damn thing. Inside, though, I was already plotting my revenge. I waited for her next business trip, which didn't take long. She told me casually over dinner, "I've got another trip coming up. Miami again. Same clients." My stomach churned at the lie, but I stayed calm. "Sure, honey. When do you leave?" I asked, my voice steady, hiding the fury inside. "Friday. Just for the weekend," she said, smiling like it was nothing. I nodded, already knowing what I was going to do. That night, while she was packing, I slipped another tracker into her suitcase, this time more prepared. I wasn't just going to watch her from afar. This time, I was going to confront them. I took a leave from work again, but this time, I didn't wait for her to leave. As soon as she was out the door, I packed my own bag and drove straight to the airport, booking the next flight to Miami. If she was going to Miami, so was I. When I landed, I checked the tracker. Sure enough, she was at another resort, not far from the beach, a different hotel this time. I booked myself into a cheap motel nearby, barely able to sleep as I imagined what she and her lover were doing. I waited until the next morning, checking the tracker every few minutes to make sure I knew exactly where they were. By late afternoon, they had settled into the hotel. That's when I made my move. I drove over to the resort, parking far enough away to avoid being seen. My heart pounded in my chest, each step closer making the rage burn hotter inside me. I reached the lobby, glanced around, and casually asked the receptionist for their room number, pretending I was a business associate meeting them for dinner. Room 509. I took the elevator up, my fists already clenched, rehearsing in my mind what I would do. I wasn't going to let her talk her way out of this. I wasn't going to let her explain or apologize. She didn't deserve that. Not after what I'd seen. When I reached the door, I paused for a second, my hand hovering over the handle. I could hear laughter, her laughter, coming from inside. My blood boiled. This was it. I burst through the door. The sight hit me like a truck. There they were, in bed together, naked, caught in the middle of their twisted fantasy. Sarah screamed in shock, scrambling to cover herself with the sheets, while the man, her lover, just stared at me, wide-eyed and frozen in place. For a split second, the room was silent, the air thick with tension. Then, the rage took over. I lunged at him before he could react, dragging him out of the bed and slamming him against the wall. He was bigger than me, stronger maybe, but I didn't care. All the anger I'd bottled up exploded in that moment. I punched him hard in the face, hearing the sickening crack as his nose broke under my fist. He tried to fight back, but I wasn't going to stop. I punched him again and again, my knuckles bruising with every hit until he was crumpled on the floor, barely able to move. Sarah was shouting something, crying, pleading, but I couldn't hear her. All I saw was red. I turned to her, still silent. She was wrapped in the sheets, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Please, just let me explain," she begged, her voice shaking. But I didn't say a word. I grabbed her arm, yanking her out of the bed and dragging her towards the door. She struggled, trying to pull away, but I was done listening to her lies. She wasn't going to talk her way out of this one. We left her lover on the floor, bleeding and groaning, as I shoved Sarah into the hallway. She kept trying to explain, talking in a frantic rush, but I stayed silent. I wasn't interested in her excuses. I wasn't interested in anything she had to say anymore. We got to the car, and I threw her bag in the trunk. She stood there, trembling, still wrapped in the hotel sheet, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't mean for it to go this far." But I cut her off. "Get in the car." She looked at me, eyes wide with shock, and I could see that this was the moment it hit her. This was real. There was no going back from this. She got into the car, still shaking, and I slammed the door shut behind her. The drive back to the airport was silent. Sarah cried the whole way, but I didn't say a word. I didn't look at her. I didn't feel anything except cold, numb rage. Every time she opened her mouth to say something, I shut her down with a look. She didn't deserve to explain. Not after what she'd done. Back at home, I couldn't sleep. I just sat in the dark, thinking about everything, about how we had ended up here. How had we gone from being happy, from planning our future, to this? I had loved her. I had trusted her. And now, all of that was gone. But despite everything, I couldn't let go. As much as I wanted to walk away, there was still a part of me that couldn't bear the thought of losing her. I didn't understand why. Maybe it was because I had invested so much into our marriage, into building a life together. Maybe it was because I still remembered the woman she used to be, the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The silence between us stretched for days after we got home. Sarah stayed in the guest room, knowing better than to approach me. I was barely holding myself together, and every time I looked at her, it was like a fresh wound opening up all over again. I had pulled her out of that hotel, humiliated her lover, and in a twisted way, I thought maybe that would make me feel better. But now, I just felt empty. What haunted me most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the cold realization that no matter how much I loved her, no matter what I did, things would never be the same again. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to throw her out. Not yet. One night, I sat in the dark, staring at the blank TV screen, trying to piece together what came next. Divorce? Maybe. But I wasn't ready to make that decision. I still didn't understand how we had gotten here. Why had she chosen him? Why now? But even those questions were starting to feel pointless. Then, the knock came. It was a firm, deliberate knock, the kind that sends a chill down your spine. I opened the door to find a police officer standing there, a stern expression on his face. "Are you James Miller?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "You're under arrest for aggravated assault," he said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. I stood there, stunned. "What? What are you talking about?" "Mr. Brandon Scott has filed charges against you for assaulting him at a hotel in Miami," the officer explained as he moved to cuff me. Brandon Scott. The lover. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just some petty fight. It was about to get much worse. Sarah rushed out from the guest room, her eyes wide with panic. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They're arresting me," I said, my voice cold. "Your lover pressed charges." Sarah's face turned pale. "No, this can't be happening. James, I'm so sorry." "I didn't." She broke off, sobbing. But there was no stopping this now. The officer led me to the patrol car, and the next thing I knew, I was sitting in a cold, sterile room at the police station, waiting to be processed. The charge was real, and I was in serious trouble. My mind raced as I tried to process what was happening. Brandon Scott was going to press this all the way, wasn't he? I had beaten him to a pulp in that hotel room, and now he was looking for revenge. Only this time, he wasn't using his fists. They took my statement, asked me all the usual questions, and eventually, I was released on bail. But the damage was done. I was facing serious charges, and if convicted, I could be looking at prison time. When I got home that night, Sarah was waiting for me, her face a mess of tears and guilt. "James, I'll fix this," she said as soon as I walked through the door. "I'll talk to him. I'll make him drop the charges." I looked at her, anger bubbling up again. "How are you going to fix this, Sarah? How do you even begin to fix this mess? You should have thought about that before you slept with him." She collapsed into sobs, but I didn't have the energy to comfort her. This was her mess, and now it had dragged me down too. All I could do was wait for the legal system to take its course. A week later, I was sitting in the office of my lawyer, Rick Benson, a no-nonsense guy with years of experience handling cases like mine. He leaned back in his chair, looking over the details. "It's not good," he said, blunt as ever. "This guy Scott has photos of his injuries, hospital records, and witnesses at the hotel who heard the commotion." I winced. I had let my emotions take over that day, and now I was paying the price. "What are my chances?" Rick sighed. "We could try to settle. Negotiate a plea deal, maybe get the charges reduced. But this guy seems determined to make you suffer. He's already contacted a civil attorney too. So you're looking at a potential lawsuit on top of the criminal charges. A lawsuit? My head spun. This was getting worse by the minute. What's he after? Money? Rick nodded. Most likely. He'll claim emotional distress, medical bills, loss of work, whatever his lawyer can think of to squeeze you for cash. I leaned forward, rubbing my face. What do I do? Rick glanced at his notes, then back at me. You've got two options. We can fight it in court, drag it out, and hope for a miracle. Or, you try to settle. Pay him off and make this go away. The thought of paying Brandon Scott anything made me sick. He had already taken so much from me. My peace, my trust, my wife. But the alternative? A long, ugly trial that could end with me in prison. Rick must have sensed my hesitation. Look, James, I get it. But right now, you need to protect yourself. This guy's out for blood, and if you're not careful, you could lose everything. Think about your job, your house, your future. I nodded slowly, the weight of it all pressing down on me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. That night, I sat down with Sarah for the first real conversation we'd had since the day I dragged her out of that hotel. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. I've been thinking, she began softly. Maybe we should go to counseling. I know I've destroyed everything, but maybe we can fix it. I looked at her, feeling the old mix of anger and heartbreak. Counseling? After all this? She nodded, wiping away a tear. I know I've hurt you, James. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I love you. I've always loved you. I just got lost in everything. Our routine, the stress of work, the feeling of being stuck. But I don't want to lose you. Her words cut deep, but I didn't know if I could believe them. Sarah, you didn't just hurt me. You shattered everything we built. And now I'm facing charges because of him. She reached out, touching my hand gently. Let me talk to Brandon. Let me try to fix this. Maybe if I can convince him to drop the charges, we can start over. I didn't know what to say. Part of me still loved her, despite everything. But the other part of me, the part that had seen her with him, the part that had beaten him senseless in that hotel room, wasn't sure if there was anything left to save. I'll think about it, I said finally, pulling my hand away. As I lay in bed that night, the weight of everything settled on my chest. My marriage, my freedom, my future. It all hung in the balance. And I didn't know if I had the strength to hold it together. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Sarah had kept her distance, knowing I needed space, but I could feel the weight of her guilt pressing down on both of us. I wasn't ready to forgive her. Maybe I never would be. But with every moment that passed, the legal battle looming over me felt more suffocating than the betrayal itself. Then came the letter. It was early morning when I found the envelope in the mailbox. Thick, official-looking, with my name on it. My heart sank before I even opened it. Inside was exactly what I feared, a formal notice. Brandon Scott was suing me for damages. Emotional distress, medical costs, loss of wages. It was all there, itemized in black and white. He wasn't just out for blood. He was out for everything I had. Sarah found me at the kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of me, my hands trembling with rage. What is it? She asked cautiously, peering over my shoulder. I shoved the letter toward her. He's suing me. Your lover is suing me, Sarah. Can you even understand how messed up this is? Her face paled as she scanned the letter, her hands shaking. I'll talk to him, she whispered. I'll go see him and what? I snapped, standing up so quickly that the chair scraped across the floor. What are you going to say to him, Sarah? That you're sorry? That it's all a big misunderstanding? What's left to say? She flinched, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know. I don't know how to fix this, James, but I'll do anything to make it right. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that maybe she could talk sense into him, make this nightmare go away. But deep down, I knew Brandon Scott wasn't going to back down. He'd tasted revenge, and now he wanted more. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts were a tangled mess of rage and fear. How had my life fallen apart so quickly? Just weeks ago, I had a wife, a career, a future. Now, I was staring down the barrel of criminal charges, a lawsuit, and a broken marriage. Everything felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and no matter how hard I tried to hold on, the more it all fell apart. The next morning, I called Rick, my lawyer. "James, I just got a copy of the lawsuit. It's pretty straightforward," he said, his voice calm but serious. "They're claiming assault and battery, with emotional distress as the kicker." His lawyer's smart. They're painting this as an unprovoked attack. Unprovoked? I snapped. He was sleeping with my wife. What the hell was I supposed to do? Rick sighed. "I get it, but the law doesn't care about that. They're going to push this hard. I'd advise you to settle, James. The longer this drags out, the worse it's going to get for you." The word settle tasted bitter in my mouth. Paying off Brandon Scott? Giving him money for destroying my life? It made me sick. But the alternative? A court battle that could leave me financially and emotionally ruined. "I'll think about it," I muttered, hanging up the phone. A few days later, Sarah sat across from me at the dinner table, her face pale and drawn. "I saw him today," she said softly. I looked up from my plate, the fork pausing midair. "And?" She took a deep breath. "I went to his apartment. I begged him to drop the charges, to stop this madness. I told him how much damage he's causing, how this is tearing you apart." I clenched my jaw, waiting for the punchline. "But he's not going to stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He wants to ruin you, James. He said that, after what you did to him, he won't rest until you pay for it." I slammed my fork down on the table, my heart pounding in my chest. "So that's it? I'm just supposed to let him take everything?" Sarah shook her head frantically, her eyes pleading. "No, there has to be another way. I'll keep trying." "Stop, Sarah," I snapped, cutting her off. "Just stop. You've done enough. Talking to him isn't going to fix this." She recoiled as if I had slapped her, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was, I don't know, lost. I thought he could give me something I was missing. But now, everything's ruined. I ruined it." For the first time in weeks, I saw the depth of her guilt, her shame, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the hotel room, the way she had laughed with him, touched him, like I never existed, and all the sympathy drained away. The lawsuit moved quickly. Weeks passed in a blur of legal paperwork and meetings with Rick. Every time we met, he'd push me harder to settle. "Look, James, you're not going to win this," he said one afternoon. "Even if we take it to trial, it's your word against his. There are witnesses, medical records, it's stacked against you. Settling is the safest option." I nodded, but the thought of giving in to Brandon made my skin crawl. Still, the pressure was mounting. Bills were piling up, and the stress of the looming trial was destroying what little peace I had left. Then, one evening, Rick called with an offer. "Scott's lawyer is willing to settle for $50,000. It's a steep number, but if we drag this out, it could cost you more in legal fees alone." My advice? Take the deal. $50,000. More than a year's salary, more than I had in savings. It would wipe me out financially, but compared to a criminal conviction, it felt like the only way out. I hung up the phone, staring at the wall, numb. How had I ended up here? A cheating wife, a lawsuit, and a life in ruins. Sarah came into the room, her face full of guilt. "What did Rick say?" she asked cautiously. I told her about the settlement offer, watching her face fall as the weight of it all hit her. "James, I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears filling her eyes again. I stood up, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. "I'm taking the deal," I said quietly. "But after this, we're done. You and me, we're over." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "No, James, please. We can fix this. I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I can't lose you." I looked at her, the woman I had once loved more than anything in the world, and felt nothing but exhaustion. "You already lost me, Sarah. The day you walked into that hotel room with him, you lost me." I sat in silence after Sarah's pleas, staring out the window, lost in thought. It was all a blur now. The betrayal, the confrontation, the looming court case. And yet, even as I faced this nightmare head-on, a part of me still wondered how we had gotten here. How could everything I had built, everything I had loved, be destroyed so easily? The settlement weighed on me like a stone. $50,000. Gone. It didn't feel like an escape. It felt like another punishment. But what choice did I have? The alternative was far worse. 2 days later, I called Rick and told him to go ahead with the settlement. He agreed, and after some paperwork, the deal was done. Brandon Scott would walk away with my money, and I would avoid a criminal trial. It was the best outcome I could hope for, but it tasted like defeat. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. Sarah was quiet, walking around the house like a ghost. She tried to talk to me a few times, but I shut her down. I couldn't deal with her guilt on top of everything else. She would leave notes for me, texts saying she was sorry, but nothing she said made a difference. I was already gone. I just hadn't left yet. A week later, the day I dreaded most came. The final check was cut, and the money was transferred to Brandon's account. It was over, or so I thought. I had hoped that with the settlement, he would disappear from our lives, but something kept gnawing at me, a sense that this wasn't truly the end. And I was right. Late that night, Sarah was sitting in the kitchen, her head in her hands, when her phone buzzed on the counter. She looked at the screen, her face turning white as she picked it up. "What is it?" I asked, sensing the shift. She hesitated, but then, as if in slow motion, handed me the phone. It was a message from Brandon. "Sarah, I think you should know that your husband's payout isn't going to cover the damage he did. You and I still have unfinished business. Meet me tomorrow. Same place. Or else." I felt my pulse spike. I stared at the message, the words burning into my brain. What the hell did this mean? I had already paid him. What more could he possibly want? Unfinished business? I echoed, looking at Sarah. What the hell is this? She buried her face in her hands, unable to meet my gaze. "James, I didn't know he would do this. I swear. He told me if I met him one last time, he'd let this go." That's what I thought. I didn't think. One last time. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. "You're telling me you were still seeing him after I caught you?" "No," she sobbed, shaking her head. "No, I swear I wasn't. But I tried to talk to him after the lawsuit, to reason with him, and he said he wouldn't stop until I agreed to meet him. But I didn't go. I swear I didn't go." I couldn't breathe. The rage that had simmered inside me for weeks now exploded into pure, unfiltered fury. "So this was never going to end," I said, my voice low and trembling with anger. "He's been stringing you along, hasn't he?" Sarah nodded, her face wet with tears. "I didn't want to tell you. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. I'm so sorry, James. I couldn't take it anymore." I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, but Sarah jumped in front of me, blocking my way. "Please, James, don't go. Don't do anything. He's dangerous. You've already lost so much. Don't lose more. Please." "Move," I said, my voice cold and flat. "This ends tonight." I drove in a blind rage, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was spinning. What the hell was Brandon playing at? He already had the money, the upper hand. What more did he want from me? I found myself parked outside the resort where they had met the last time. The same resort where I had discovered them together. The rage in my chest boiled over as I stepped out of the car, the memory of that day crashing down on me like a wave. I made my way to the front desk, but this time, I didn't ask for his room number. I knew where to find him. My fists clenched. I stormed through the lobby and up the stairs, heading straight for the private suites. When I reached the door, I pounded on it with everything I had. For a moment, there was silence, then a shuffle of footsteps inside. The door opened, and there he was, Brandon Scott, smirking at me like the smug bastard he was. "What the hell do you want, James?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe, clearly unafraid. "You here to hit me again? Because last time didn't work out so well for you." My vision blurred with fury. I stepped closer, getting in his face. "You're going to drop this. All of it. You're going to stay away from Sarah. And if you ever come near us again, I swear I'll—" Brandon cut me off with a laugh. "You'll what? Beat me up again?" I could ruin you right now with another call to the police. You've already handed me a nice payday, but you know what? It's not about the money anymore. It's about control. I froze, my fists shaking with restraint. You think this is just about Sarah? This is about watching you squirm. It's about watching you lose everything, piece by piece. You think you're the victim here, but you're just as much of a coward as I am. You want your wife back, but deep down, you know she doesn't want you anymore. His words hit like a sledgehammer. I lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar, but I stopped myself before I threw another punch. That's what he wanted, for me to lose control. Instead, I let him go. I straightened up, breathing hard, staring him down. You think you've won, Brandon, but I'm not playing this game anymore. He laughed again, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest, knowing that I had just made the hardest decision of my life. When I got home, Sarah was waiting for me, her eyes red from crying. I didn't say anything. I just walked past her, up to the bedroom. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of everything finally settled over me. I had faced Brandon. I had seen through his sick game, but the damage was done. Tomorrow, I would file for divorce. The morning came with a crushing sense of finality. I had made my decision. I was filing for divorce. After everything, there was no saving this. The affair, the lies, the lawsuit. Sarah and I were done. I had planned it all out in my head, imagining what I'd say to her when the papers were ready. I pictured her reaction, the shock, the tears, the pleading, and yet, despite everything, I still felt a dull ache in my chest. This wasn't how I imagined my life would turn out, but I was done holding on to something that no longer existed. Sarah was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. Her eyes were red, and she hadn't slept much. She knew something was coming, and I wasn't going to delay it any longer. "We need to talk," I said, my voice flat. She looked up at me, her face pale, the fear in her eyes unmistakable. "What is it, James?" she asked quietly, already sensing the weight of what I was about to say. "I'm filing for divorce." The words hung in the air, heavier than I expected. I watched her face crumple, the full reality of what was happening sinking in. She started shaking her head, tears spilling over. No, James, please. We can work this out. I know I hurt you. I know I destroyed everything, but I love you. I'll do anything to make this right." I stared at her, feeling the old mix of anger and heartbreak. "There's nothing left to work out, Sarah. You made your choice when you cheated on me, and you kept making that choice over and over, even after I found out. You're sorry now because you got caught, but the trust is gone. I can't be with someone I can't trust." She collapsed onto the chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, James. Please, don't leave me. I'll go to counseling. I'll quit my job. I'll do anything. Just don't walk away from us. Don't throw away our life together." I wanted to feel something. Sympathy, pity, anything. But all I felt was numb. It wasn't that I didn't love her anymore. A part of me would probably always care for her. But the damage she had done was too deep to fix. The lies, the betrayal, the humiliation. It was all too much. "I'm not throwing anything away," I said, my voice steady but cold. "You did. You threw it all away when you chose him." Sarah broke down completely, sobbing into her hands, and I turned away. I couldn't watch her like this. Not anymore. I left the house and drove straight to my lawyer's office, my mind racing with everything that had led to this point. Rick was waiting for me when I arrived. He looked at me with a mixture of concern and professionalism. "You ready to do this?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "I am," I said, sitting down across from him. "I want to file for divorce as soon as possible." He nodded, shuffling through his papers. "We'll get started right away. Given everything that's happened, her affair, the lawsuit, you'll be in a strong position. We can request favorable terms in the settlement, especially since she was at fault." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't care about the money, Rick. I just want this to be over." He glanced up, studying me for a moment. "It will be, but you need to be prepared. Divorce isn't easy. Even if she's at fault, it's going to be a process." I nodded, knowing he was right. This wasn't going to be quick or painless, but I had already been through enough pain to last a lifetime. I could handle this. Days passed like a blur. Sarah stayed at the house, barely speaking, her face hollow and tear-streaked. I had already moved into the guest room, and the silence between us grew thicker with each day. It was like we were strangers living under the same roof, walking on broken glass, waiting for the inevitable. Then, one evening, I received an unexpected call from Rick. "I've got news, James," he said, his voice tense. "Brandon Scott was arrested this morning." I froze. Arrested? For what? For extortion. It took a moment for the words to sink in. "What do you mean, extortion?" Rick explained. Turns out, Scott wasn't content with just the settlement money. He had been threatening several other people, including business associates, trying to squeeze money out of them. One of them recorded the threats and handed them over to the police. The investigation uncovered a pattern of behavior, including his threats toward you and Sarah. I sat there, stunned. "So, what does this mean for me?" "It means his lawsuit against you is effectively dead. His credibility is shot, and with the extortion charges piling up, he'll have bigger problems to deal with than suing you for assault. We can request that the settlement be nullified." For the first time in what felt like months, I let out a breath of relief. The weight that had been pressing down on me lifted, if only slightly. Brandon Scott was finally getting what he deserved. "Thank God," I muttered. "That bastard." Rick chuckled softly. "Yeah, looks like karma finally caught up with him." I thanked him and hung up, still trying to wrap my head around the sudden turn of events. For weeks, I had been living under the shadow of Brandon's threats, his control over my life. And now, just like that, it was over. But as the relief washed over me, I realized something else. This wasn't the victory I thought it would be. It didn't fix what was broken. It didn't take away the pain of Sarah's betrayal or the emptiness I felt every time I thought about our marriage. Brandon was out of my life, but Sarah was still here. And so was the broken trust, the shattered love that used to bind us together. The next morning, I sat across from Sarah in the kitchen. She looked at me with tired, red eyes, barely holding herself together. "Brandon's been arrested," I said flatly. "The lawsuit is gone. He's not going to come after us anymore." Sarah blinked, processing the news. "He's arrested? How?" "Extortion. It doesn't matter now. He's out of the picture." She nodded slowly, but the relief I expected to see never crossed her face. Instead, she just looked defeated. "That doesn't change anything between us, does it?" I shook my head, my voice soft but firm. "No, Sarah, it doesn't." She broke down again, sobbing into her hands. And this time, as much as I wanted to stay cold and distant, I couldn't. I reached out, my hand resting on hers. Not out of love, but out of sympathy for the woman who had once been my everything, and who had now lost everything. Weeks passed, and the dust started to settle, though my life felt permanently altered. Brandon Scott was behind bars, facing multiple charges that ensured he'd be out of our lives for good. The lawsuit was officially dropped, and the settlement I had painfully agreed to was voided. Legally, I was free, but freedom didn't feel like the relief I thought it would. I was left with the hollow realization that, despite Brandon being gone, the damage was done. My life, my marriage, was irreparably broken. Every time I walked through the house, it felt like a tomb, a reminder of what I had lost, what Sarah and I had destroyed. Sarah stayed, though not for long. We barely spoke. She was a shadow of herself, but so was I. The silence between us wasn't hostile anymore. It was just sad. The papers were in motion, and in a matter of months, our marriage would be dissolved. The life we had spent a decade building would officially be over. One night, Sarah knocked on my bedroom door, her face drawn and exhausted. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can we talk?" I hesitated. We had avoided serious conversations since the day I told her I was filing for divorce. It wasn't that I didn't have things to say. I just didn't know what good talking would do anymore. Still, I nodded and gestured for her to come in. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I've been thinking," she began softly, "about everything. About us. About what I did." She paused, taking a shaky breath. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't mean much anymore. I know I hurt you in ways I can't undo. But I need you to know that I never wanted it to end like this. I watched her, my emotions strangely distant. I believed her, but it didn't change anything. I wasn't unhappy with you, she continued, her voice cracking. I was unhappy with myself. I felt trapped in my own life, like I was suffocating. But it had nothing to do with you. You were always good to me. You didn't deserve any of this. I stayed silent, unsure of how to respond. What was there to say? I thought I could find something with Brandon, she went on, her tears flowing freely now. I thought it was excitement, passion, whatever. But it was a lie. He didn't care about me. And when I realized that, it was too late. I had already destroyed everything that mattered. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation. I don't expect you to forgive me, James. I don't. But I need you to know that I still love you. And I always will. Her words hung in the air, raw and painful. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel the hurt, the anger, and yes, the love that still lingered somewhere deep inside me. But the trust, the bond we once shared, that was gone. And without that, love wasn't enough. I believe you, I said quietly, my voice steady. But it doesn't change anything. What we had, it's broken, Sarah. I don't know how to fix it, and I don't think we can. She nodded, her tears falling silently now. I know, she whispered, wiping her eyes. I just wanted you to hear it from me. I didn't want us to end without you knowing how sorry I am. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. There was no malice left, no anger between us, just sadness for what could have been, for what was lost. Sarah stood up, taking a deep breath. I'm going to stay with my sister for a while, she said softly. I think it's best if I give you some space. Okay, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. She lingered for a moment longer, as if searching for something, some last piece of hope, but there was none left to find. Finally, she turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind her. The day Sarah left was surreal. She packed quietly, not saying much, and I didn't offer any words of comfort. When the front door clicked shut, it felt like the final chapter of a long, painful story coming to a close. I sat in the empty house, the silence deafening. Everything felt different. The relief I had been waiting for, the sense of finality, it was there, but it wasn't the kind of relief that brought peace. It was the kind that came with a deep, aching emptiness. I spent the next few days moving through life like a ghost. The legal battles were over, and the divorce would soon be finalized. My friends reached out, offering support, but I wasn't ready to talk about it. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when I found myself going through old photos. I saw pictures of Sarah and me from years ago, smiling, happy, young. We looked like strangers now. Those people were long gone, buried under the weight of everything that had happened. I put the photos away, realizing that it was time to move on, truly move on. Holding onto the past, onto the pain, wasn't going to help me heal. And as much as it hurt to let go of the life I had envisioned for us, I knew I had to. There was no going back. The final divorce hearing came and went without much fanfare. It was clinical, cold, just signatures and legal jargon that marked the end of our marriage. Sarah and I sat across from each other in the courtroom, exchanging only polite nods. There was nothing left to say. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't joy or freedom. It was simply the absence of something heavy, the absence of a burden that had been weighing me down for too long. As I drove home, the sun setting in the distance, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't that everything was okay. It wasn't. But for the first time in months, I could see the possibility of a future beyond the pain. A future where I wasn't defined by what Sarah had done or by what Brandon had taken from me. It would take time. Healing always does. But I was ready to start. Ready to rebuild. Not with Sarah, not with the life I had lost, but with the life I still had ahead of me.